They say power protects a man from danger, but on one cold Chicago night power meant nothing when 12 men quietly closed the circle around Adrian Russo. The alley behind the restaurant was narrow and poorly lit, the kind of place most people passed without a second thought, but Adrian Russo was not most people. He stepped out of the back entrance of the building with the calm confidence of a man who had spent his entire life walking through dangerous situations without flinching. The rain from earlier that evening had left the pavement slick and reflective, turning the dim streetlights into long streaks of yellow across the wet concrete. The city noise from the main street just 1 block away was distant here, softened by the brick walls and metal dumpsters that lined the alley. Adrian adjusted the collar of his dark overcoat as he walked slowly toward the exit of the alley, his footsteps steady and controlled. For a moment, everything seemed ordinary. Then he noticed the first man standing near the mouth of the alley. The stranger did not move. He simply leaned against the wall with his arms folded, watching Adrian approach. A second man stepped into view from the shadows near a dumpster. Then a third. Within seconds, Adrian understood what was happening. By the time he stopped walking, 12 men had positioned themselves around him in a loose circle. None of them raised their voices. None of them rushed forward. They simply stood there, closing the distance little by little. Adrian glanced calmly from one face to another. Years of experience had taught him that the most dangerous moments were often the quiet ones. One of the men smiled slightly as he stepped forward into the weak glow of a flickering alley lamp. "Well," the man said slowly, "look who decided to take a walk tonight." Adrian did not answer. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes carefully measured the space between each person surrounding him. There were no obvious weapons, no sudden movements. Just 12 men who had decided to control the space he was standing in. The man who had spoken tilted his head slightly, as if studying Adrian's calm reaction. "Relax," he continued, spreading his hands casually. "Nobody here wants trouble." The other men chuckled softly, though none of them stepped aside. Adrian's voice was steady when he finally spoke. "Then, you should move." The group laughed again, the sound echoing faintly against the brick walls. "Not tonight," another man said from behind him. "Tonight the king walks through the alley like everyone else." Adrian remained still, his posture relaxed but alert. If someone had looked closely, they might have noticed the subtle way he shifted his weight, calculating every possible path through the tightening circle. But there was something else in that alley that none of the men seemed to notice. In the far corner, near a rusted metal barrel, sat a woman wrapped in a worn gray coat. Grace Walker had been there long before Adrian entered the alley. To most people, she was invisible, just another homeless figure sitting quietly beside a few crumpled newspapers and a small backpack. Her gray hair peeked out from beneath a knitted hat, and her tired eyes watched the scene unfolding before her without panic. She had seen moments like this before during the many years she had spent living on the edges of the city, where people rarely looked twice at someone sitting quietly in the shadows. The circle around Adrian Russo grew tighter, the men stepping forward just enough to remove the space he needed to walk away. Adrian looked once more toward the mouth of the alley, and then back at the group surrounding him. No one noticed the small movement in the corner, where Grace Walker slowly reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out an old metal lighter. The small flame flickered to life in her hand, casting a brief warm glow across her weathered face. At that moment, no one in the alley understood that the quiet woman sitting beside a rusted barrel was about to change everything. The small flame from Grace Walker's lighter flickered quietly in the corner of the alley, so small that none of the 12 men surrounding Adrian Russo paid attention to it at first. The wind moved gently through the narrow space between the brick walls, making the flame dance for a moment before stabilizing again in her steady hand. Adrian noticed it immediately. Years of surviving difficult situations had sharpened his awareness of the smallest details, and the warm glow from the lighter caught his eye the moment it appeared. For a brief second, his gaze shifted toward the corner where the homeless woman sat beside the rusted barrel. She did not look frightened. She did not look surprised either. She simply watched the scene with the quiet patience of someone who had seen many nights unfold in many alleys like this one. The men standing closest to Adrian continued speaking among themselves with casual confidence. One of them kicked lightly at a loose piece of gravel on the pavement and laughed. "You know what is funny?" he said to the others. "Everyone thinks the powerful guys have bodyguards everywhere. But tonight, look at this." Just one man walking alone. Another man stepped forward slightly, tightening the circle. Maybe the king wanted some fresh air, he said mockingly. Adrian remained calm. His hands stayed relaxed at his sides, though his mind was measuring every step each person took. There was still space between them, but not much. If he tried to move too quickly, the entire group would close in at once. The alley felt smaller with every passing second. Meanwhile, Grace Walker continued watching quietly from her corner. The flame from her lighter burned steadily now, casting a faint orange glow on the crumpled newspaper beside her backpack. She glanced briefly at the security camera mounted high on the wall above the alley entrance. It was small and easy to miss, especially in the poor lighting. Most people who walked through the alley never noticed it at all. Grace had noticed it the first night she slept there. Slowly she leaned forward and touched the edge of the newspaper with the small flame. The paper caught the fire almost instantly. The thin sheet curled and darkened as the fire spread across its surface. Grace did not rush. She simply placed the burning newspaper carefully into the metal barrel beside her. Within seconds the flame grew larger, bright enough to throw warm light across the alley walls. The sudden change in brightness caught everyone's attention. One of the men turned his head. "What is that?" he muttered. Another looked toward the corner where Grace sat. The fire inside the barrel crackled softly as the newspaper burned, sending a column of light upward that illuminated the surrounding brick and the objects mounted along the wall. Adrian watched quietly as the orange glow reached higher and higher. The security camera above the alley entrance became clearly visible under the growing light. The men surrounding Adrian noticed it at almost the same moment. Several of them glanced upward instinctively. One frowned. "Was that there before?" he asked quietly. Another shifted his stance, suddenly less comfortable than he had been seconds earlier. Grace Walker spoke for the first time, her voice calm and steady. "Funny thing about fire," she said without looking directly at anyone. "It lights up everything people forget to see." The crackling flame inside the barrel grew brighter as another piece of paper caught fire. The alley that had once been dark and private now looked very different under the shifting glow. Faces that had been hidden in shadow were suddenly visible, and the small black security camera above them watched the entire scene without blinking. The fire inside the rusted barrel continued to grow brighter as the burning newspaper curled slowly into glowing embers, and the warm orange light pushed away the darkness that had once protected the 12 men standing around Adrian Russo. The alley that had felt private only moments earlier now looked completely different. Every face was clearly visible. Every movement reflected off the wet pavement. And most importantly, the small black security camera mounted above the alley entrance now sat fully exposed in the bright flickering glow. Adrian noticed the change immediately. The subtle shift in the atmosphere was almost invisible, yet powerful enough to alter the entire balance of the situation. Just seconds earlier the men surrounding him had stood confidently, their relaxed smiles suggesting they controlled every inch of the alley. Now those same faces showed something new. Uncertainty. One of the men near the edge of the circle looked up at the camera again, his expression tightening slightly. "Hey," he muttered to the man beside him. "That thing recording?" Another man turned to look as well, squinting against the brightness of the fire. "Probably," he said under his breath. "Most places have cameras now." The man who had been doing most of the talking earlier shifted his weight uncomfortably and glanced toward the alley entrance where the camera was mounted. For the first time since the group had surrounded Adrian, the tight formation of their circle loosened slightly. Adrian remained perfectly still, but inside his mind, he could feel the moment changing. Fear rarely arrived suddenly. Instead it crept into situations slowly, appearing first as doubt, then hesitation, and finally the realization that the plan might not be as safe as it once seemed. Grace Walker added another sheet of newspaper to the fire with calm, deliberate movements. The flame responded immediately, sending another wave of light dancing across the alley walls. She still did not look directly at the group. Her voice carried softly through the crackling fire. "Funny how people forget cameras exist until the lights come on." One of the men looked sharply toward her. "Hey lady, mind your business," he said with forced irritation. Grace shrugged lightly beneath her worn coat. "I am minding it," she replied calmly. "Warm fire on a cold night." Another man shifted again, glancing from the fire to the camera above the alley entrance. "You think anyone watching that thing?" he asked quietly. The first man hesitated. Who knows, he said. But if it is recording, his sentence trailed off as the possibilities settled into everyone's mind at once. Adrian saw the opening the moment it appeared. It was not a physical gap in the circle, but something far more powerful. Confidence had begun to crack. He took a slow step forward, not rushing, not forcing anything, simply moving through the space that hesitation had created. None of the men stopped him. They were too busy looking upward toward the camera and back toward the bright fire that now illuminated every corner of the alley. Adrian took another step, his calm posture unchanged. By the time the man closest to him realized what was happening, Adrian had already moved past the tightest part of the circle. The man opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again when his eyes drifted back toward the small black camera watching silently from above. The circle that had once trapped Adrian Russo no longer existed. It had dissolved into a loose group of men standing uncertainly in the shifting firelight. Adrian walked toward the mouth of the alley without looking back, his footsteps steady against the wet pavement. Only when he reached the brighter light near the street did he pause and glance once over his shoulder. Grace Walker still sat beside the barrel, calmly feeding another scrap of newspaper into the fire as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The men who had surrounded him stood awkwardly in the glowing light, suddenly aware that the quiet alley they thought belonged to them was no longer as private as they had imagined. The glow of the fire slowly faded behind Adrian Russo as he reached the mouth of the alley, the bright streetlights from the main road spilling across the pavement and washing away the shadows that had once hidden the circle of men. For a moment he paused beneath the light, his eyes adjusting as the sounds of the city returned to him. Cars moved along the avenue 1 block away, their engines humming steadily, and distant voices drifted from a nearby restaurant patio. The ordinary rhythm of Chicago nightlife continued as if nothing unusual had just happened a few yards behind him. Adrian slipped his hands calmly into the pockets of his overcoat and exhaled slowly. Anyone watching him from the street would have assumed he had simply stepped outside for air. Yet his mind replayed every second of what had unfolded inside the alley. The tightening circle, the quiet confidence of the men who thought they had complete control, and the small flame that had quietly undone their plan. Adrian turned his head slightly and glanced back toward the alley entrance. The orange glow from the barrel fire still flickered against the brick walls deeper inside the passageway. From where he stood, he could just make out the silhouette of the woman who had been sitting there all along. Grace Walker remained beside the rusted barrel, calmly feeding another scrap of newspaper into the fire as if the entire event had been nothing more than a small interruption to her evening. The men who had surrounded Adrian had begun to disperse slowly, their earlier confidence replaced by awkward glances toward the security camera and the bright fire that had exposed them. None of them followed Adrian toward the street. Their plan had dissolved the moment the alley stopped feeling private. Adrian studied the scene for a few seconds longer before turning fully around and walking back toward the deeper shadows of the alley. His footsteps were quiet against the wet pavement as he approached the barrel where Grace sat. She looked up briefly when she noticed him returning, but did not appear surprised. The firelight illuminated the lines on her weathered face and the worn edges of her coat. "Thought you were leaving," she said calmly without standing. Adrian stopped beside the barrel, the warmth from the fire brushing lightly against the front of his coat. "I was," he replied. His voice remained steady, but his eyes studied her carefully now that the tension of the earlier moment had passed. Grace nodded slightly and pushed another folded newspaper toward the flame with a small stick she had picked up from the ground. The paper caught fire quickly, adding another burst of light to the alley. "Cold night," she said simply. Adrian glanced briefly toward the entrance where the security camera remained fixed above the wall. The men who had been standing there minutes earlier were now gone. The alley had returned to the quiet emptiness it usually held at this hour. "You knew that camera was there," Adrian said after a moment. Grace shrugged gently. "Been sleeping in this alley long enough," she replied. "You notice things." Adrian allowed himself a faint smile, though it was more thoughtful than amused. "You also knew lighting that fire would make everyone nervous." Grace looked at him for a moment before answering. "People get brave in the dark," she said, "but light makes them think." The two of them stood quietly beside the barrel as the fire crackled between them. Adrian studied the woman who had just disrupted 12 men with nothing more than a lighter and a piece of newspaper. There had been no panic in her movements, no attempt to draw attention to herself. Just a simple action that had shifted the balance of the entire situation. After a few seconds, Adrian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather card holder. He removed a single white card and held it toward her. Grace looked at the card but did not take it immediately. "What is that for?" she asked. Adrian answered calmly. "In case you ever decide you are tired of sleeping in alleys." Grace stared at the card for another second before slowly accepting it. The firelight flickered across the printed name on its surface as she turned it over in her fingers. Adrian Russo. She slipped the card carefully into the pocket of her coat and leaned back against the brick wall beside the barrel. The fire continued to burn quietly as the two strangers shared the silence of the alley, each of them understanding that something small but important had just happened in the flicker of a lighter. The fire inside the rusted barrel crackled softly as the last pieces of newspaper curled into glowing embers, sending thin ribbons of smoke twisting upward into the cold night air. Adrian Russo remained standing beside the barrel for several seconds after Grace Walker slipped his card into the pocket of her worn coat. The alley had returned to the quiet stillness it usually carried after midnight. The 12 men who had surrounded him earlier had completely disappeared, leaving behind only wet footprints fading slowly on the pavement. The small security camera above the alley entrance continued watching silently, its presence no longer dramatic now that the tension had passed. Adrian looked toward the camera for a moment and then back at Grace. She had already settled again against the brick wall, her posture relaxed as if the entire situation had been nothing more than a minor disturbance in an otherwise ordinary night. She rubbed her hands together briefly near the warmth of the fire and adjusted the edge of her coat. Adrian studied her carefully. It was not the action of lighting a fire that interested him. Anyone could strike a lighter. What caught his attention was the calm precision behind her decision. She had not shouted for help. She had not panicked when 12 men filled the alley. She had simply introduced light into a place where those men believed darkness protected them. After a moment, Adrian spoke again. "You were not afraid," he said quietly. Grace lifted her eyes toward him but did not immediately answer. The glow from the barrel fire flickered across her face, revealing the calm steadiness in her expression. Finally, she shrugged slightly. "Fear does not help much when you have already seen worse things," she replied. Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Worse things?" Grace gave a small, distant smile, as if remembering a chapter of her life that belonged somewhere far from this alley. "Life on the street teaches you how people behave," she said. "Men who want trouble prefer the dark." Adrian nodded slowly, accepting the simple truth in her words. He looked down at the barrel for a moment, watching a small piece of paper collapse into gray ash. "You understood exactly what they were doing," he said. Grace glanced toward the alley entrance where the camera remained mounted above the wall. "And they forgot someone might be watching," she answered calmly. Adrian slipped his hands back into the pockets of his overcoat, the warmth of the fire touching his face while the cold air moved gently behind him from the street. "You disrupted 12 men with nothing but a lighter," he said. Grace let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "No," she said. "The camera did that." Adrian looked at her again with quiet respect. There was no pride in her voice, no expectation that the moment would earn her anything in return. She had simply corrected an imbalance she did not like seeing. After another moment, Adrian spoke once more. "How long have you been here?" Grace glanced around the alley as if the bricks and dumpsters were simply part of the scenery. "A few months," she said. "It is quiet. The restaurant throws away decent food sometimes." Adrian absorbed the answer silently. The woman who had just shifted the outcome of a dangerous situation had been living quietly beside a dumpster and a rusted barrel for months. The thought lingered in his mind longer than he expected. Grace stretched her legs slightly and leaned back against the wall again. "You should go," she added after a moment. "Men like that usually come back looking for their pride." Adrian allowed a faint smile to cross his face. "Men like that usually do not return when a camera is watching," he replied calmly. Grace shrugged again and looked back into the fire. Adrian stepped away from the barrel and began walking toward the alley entrance once more. The glow of the fire faded behind him as he reached the brighter light of the street. Just before stepping out onto the sidewalk, he paused briefly and looked back. Grace Walker was still sitting quietly beside the barrel, feeding another small scrap of paper into the flame as if the entire night had been nothing more than a passing moment in a long and quiet life. The sound of Adrian Russo's footsteps faded into the noise of the street as he finally stepped out of the alley and into the brighter lights of the avenue, but the image of the quiet woman beside the rusted barrel remained firmly in his mind. The city continued moving around him in its usual rhythm, taxis rolling past, late-night pedestrians crossing intersections, and the glow of storefront windows reflecting across the damp pavement. To anyone watching, Adrian Russo looked exactly the same as he always did, calm, composed, and completely in control. Yet inside his thoughts something had shifted in a way he had not expected. He had spent years navigating situations where power decided the outcome. Money moved people. Influence moved systems. Fear moved enemies. But what he had just witnessed in that alley had been something entirely different. Grace Walker had changed the direction of 12 men, using nothing more than a small flame and a quiet understanding of how people think when they believe they are hidden. Adrian reached the curb where a black sedan waited silently along the street. The driver stepped out immediately and opened the rear door with a respectful nod. "Good evening, sir," the driver said calmly. Adrian paused for a moment before entering the vehicle. He glanced back once more toward the alley entrance where the faint orange glow from the barrel fire still flickered against the brick walls. For a second the scene looked almost peaceful. A small fire. A quiet figure beside it. The kind of image most people would never notice in a large city. Adrian finally stepped into the car, and the door closed softly behind him. The sedan pulled away from the curb and merged into the slow flow of traffic moving through downtown Chicago. Inside the vehicle, the interior lights cast a soft glow across the leather seats as the driver spoke again. "Everything all right, sir?" Adrian nodded slowly. "Yes," he replied. The answer was simple, but his mind remained on the alley behind them. As the car moved through the city streets, he replayed the moment when the flame first appeared in Grace Walker's hand. It had been such a small thing. A lighter, a newspaper, a rusted barrel. Yet that small decision had broken the confidence of 12 men who believed they controlled the night. Adrian leaned slightly back into the seat and looked out the window as the buildings passed by in quiet rows of light and shadow. "Turn around," he said suddenly. The driver glanced into the mirror with mild surprise. "Sir." Adrian's voice remained calm. "Take us back." The sedan slowed and carefully turned at the next intersection before heading back toward the restaurant where the alley waited in the darkness behind it. A few minutes later, the car returned to the same block and stopped once again near the alley entrance. Adrian stepped out and walked quietly back down the narrow passageway. The barrel fire still burned, though the flames were smaller now. Grace Walker remained sitting beside it exactly as before, warming her hands above the fading heat. She looked up when she heard his footsteps returning and raised one eyebrow slightly. "Forgot something?" she asked calmly. Adrian stopped beside the barrel again, the firelight reflecting across his coat. For a moment, he simply watched the glowing embers inside the barrel. Then he spoke quietly. "I realized something." Grace tilted her head slightly, but said nothing. Adrian looked toward her. "You did not just help me tonight," he said. "You reminded me of something most people forget." Grace waited patiently for him to finish the thought. Adrian glanced toward the alley entrance where the camera still watched silently above the wall. "Light changes everything," he said. Grace Walker watched the small flames inside the barrel settle into a steady glow while Adrian Russo stood beside her in the quiet alley, his words about light changing everything still hanging softly in the cold night air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city continued moving beyond the mouth of the alley, distant traffic lights blinking and engines humming somewhere far beyond the brick walls. Yet inside the narrow space, time seemed to slow. Grace rubbed her hands together near the fading warmth and glanced up at Adrian again with a calm expression. "You came back just to say that?" she asked quietly. Adrian allowed the faintest hint of a smile to appear before answering. "Partly," he said, "but also because I realized I walked away without asking something important." Grace leaned back slightly against the wall, waiting. Adrian studied her carefully, noticing the small details he had overlooked earlier in the tension of the night. The worn stitching along the sleeve of her coat, the small backpack resting beside the barrel, the quiet patience in her eyes that suggested she had learned long ago how to survive long nights without expecting anyone to notice. "Why that alley?" Adrian finally asked. Grace followed his gaze around the space, as if seeing it the way he saw it now. It is quiet, she replied simply. Restaurants throw away food sometimes. And the security camera helps. Adrian looked up briefly toward the camera again, then back at her. You trust the camera more than the people walking through here? Grace gave a small shrug. The camera does not pretend, she said. The fire crackled softly between them as another corner of newspaper turned to ash. Adrian found himself nodding slowly, appreciating the blunt truth of her answer. In his world, many people pretended. Loyalty was often temporary, and promises usually carried conditions hidden beneath the surface. Yet the woman sitting beside the barrel had shown none of that. She had seen 12 men surrounding someone in a dark alley and simply corrected the situation using the simplest tool available to her. Adrian spoke again after a moment. You changed the outcome tonight. Grace shook her head gently. No, she said. They changed their own minds when the light came on. Adrian considered the answer carefully. The calm logic behind it was unmistakable. Most people would not think that quickly, he said. Grace stared into the small fire for a second before responding. Most people are busy surviving their own problems, she replied. Adrian let the silence return again, though this time it felt less like tension and more like quiet understanding. Finally, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat once more. Grace noticed the movement immediately, but did not react. Adrian pulled out a second card, slightly thicker than the first, and held it between his fingers for a moment before offering it to her. Grace looked down at the card and raised an eyebrow. Another one? She asked. Adrian nodded. The first one is my number, he said calmly. This one is an address. Grace slowly accepted the card and turned it over in the firelight. The glow reflected off the printed text, revealing the name of a building several blocks away. She glanced up at him again. What is there? Adrian answered simply. A small apartment above one of my restaurants. It has been empty for months. Grace studied his face for a moment as if trying to decide whether the offer was serious or simply another polite gesture that powerful people sometimes made when they felt generous. Adrian spoke before she could ask. You do not owe me anything, he said quietly. But you should not have to sleep beside a dumpster when you have the kind of mind that can outthink 12 men. Grace looked down again at the card resting in her hand. The fire crackled softly while the decision formed slowly in her thoughts. When she finally looked up again, her voice remained calm, but there was a hint of surprise beneath it. You are serious, she said. Adrian nodded once. Very. Grace slipped the second card carefully into her coat pocket beside the first one. Then she leaned back against the wall again and looked at the fading fire. The alley remained quiet, the camera still watching silently above them. And for the first time that night, Adrian Russo realized that the most powerful moment he had experienced in years had come from a small flame held by someone the world had forgotten. Grace Walker remained seated beside the barrel long after Adrian Russo finished speaking, the two cards resting quietly inside the pocket of her coat, while the last pieces of newspaper slowly turned into ash. The small fire that had once illuminated the entire alley now burned low, its fading glow casting soft shadows across the brick walls. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply watching the embers shift and collapse in the metal barrel. Adrian did not rush her answer. He stood calmly beside the fire with the patience of someone who understood that certain decisions could not be hurried. The cold night air drifted through the alley again, carrying the distant sounds of the city with it. Somewhere a car door closed. A train rumbled faintly far away. Chicago continued moving as it always did. Grace finally reached into her coat pocket and slowly removed the second card Adrian had given her. She held it near the fading firelight and read the address again, her eyes moving carefully across the printed letters. The idea of a quiet room somewhere above a restaurant felt distant, almost unreal, like a memory from another lifetime she had once lived. For months the alley had been her world. The brick wall had been her shelter. The barrel had been her warmth. People passed by the entrance of the alley every day without ever knowing she was there. Grace turned the card slowly between her fingers before speaking again. You really leave apartments empty? She asked. Adrian gave a small nod. Sometimes, he replied. Restaurants expand. Plans change. Buildings wait. Grace studied his face for a moment, as if measuring whether the opportunity he offered came with hidden conditions. What she saw instead was calm certainty. Adrian Russo was not a man who made careless offers. If he had handed her the address, it meant the door truly existed. Grace slipped the card back into her coat pocket beside the first one and leaned forward slightly, using a small stick to shift the last glowing pieces of newspaper inside the barrel. The fire flared briefly before settling again. "I have been in this alley a long time," she said quietly. Adrian nodded once. "Long enough to understand people," he replied. Grace looked up at him with a faint smile. "Long enough to know when someone is serious." The alley remained silent for several seconds. Finally, Grace stood up slowly, brushing a little dust from her coat. Adrian noticed immediately that even after standing, she did not seem hurried or uncertain. She simply looked once more around the alley that had been her shelter. The brick walls, the rusted barrel, the camera mounted above the entrance. Then she looked back at Adrian. "If the room is real," she said calmly, "I will take a look at it tomorrow." Adrian nodded again. "That is all I ask." Grace bent down and picked up her small backpack, slinging the worn strap over her shoulder. The movement was simple, but for the first time since Adrian had met her, it carried the quiet weight of someone preparing to leave a place behind. She gave the barrel one final glance and gently pushed the remaining embers with the stick until the fire faded into darkness. The alley grew dim again, returning to the shadows that had hidden it earlier in the night. Adrian watched her carefully. "You are leaving tonight?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "No," she said. "Tonight I will sleep. Tomorrow I will see what tomorrow looks like." Adrian allowed a quiet smile to appear as he stepped back toward the entrance of the alley. Grace Walker followed a few steps behind him until they both reached the edge of the streetlight spilling into the passageway. The bright glow of the city illuminated the sidewalk ahead of them. Grace stopped there and looked once more toward the dark alley behind her. Adrian noticed the moment of silence and waited without speaking. Finally, she turned away from the shadows and stepped forward into the light. The next morning, the city looked completely different under the pale gray light of early dawn, and the alley that had once held the quiet fire and the rusted barrel felt smaller now, almost ordinary, as if the events of the previous night had simply been a brief flicker in the long rhythm of the city. Grace Walker woke slowly as the cold morning air moved through the narrow passageway, the familiar sounds of delivery trucks and distant traffic replacing the quiet stillness of midnight. For a few seconds she remained still, listening to the morning unfold around her, before remembering the two cards resting inside the pocket of her coat. She reached into the fabric and pulled them out carefully. The first card carried Adrian Russo's name and number. The second carried the address he had given her. She studied the printed letters again while the sunlight gradually reached the mouth of the alley. The address was not far, only a few blocks away. Grace slipped the cards back into her pocket and slowly stood, lifting her small backpack onto her shoulder. The barrel beside her was cold now, the ashes inside it gray and quiet. The alley that had protected her for months looked exactly the same as always, but something inside her had shifted during the night. She walked toward the entrance and stepped into the morning light. The streets were already busy with early commuters and delivery drivers moving through downtown Chicago. No one noticed the quiet woman stepping out of the alley, and that was exactly how the city usually worked. Grace walked calmly through the sidewalks for several minutes, following the address Adrian had given her. When she reached the building, she stopped for a moment and looked up at it. It was a modest brick restaurant with tall windows and a small door along the side that led to the upper floor. Nothing about it looked grand or intimidating. It simply looked like a place where people worked and lived ordinary lives. Grace approached the door and knocked lightly. After a moment, the door opened, and a young employee looked out with mild curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked politely. Grace reached into her pocket and handed him the card with Adrian Russo's name. The employee's expression changed immediately as he recognized the name printed on the card. He nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Yes, ma'am," he said respectfully. "We were told you might arrive." Grace followed him through the hallway and up a narrow staircase that led to the small apartment above the restaurant. When the door opened, she stepped inside and looked around slowly. The room was simple but warm. A bed stood near the window. A small kitchen occupied one corner. Clean blankets rested neatly folded across the mattress. Sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating the quiet space. Grace placed her backpack on the floor and stood silently in the middle of the room. For the first time in many months, she was standing inside a place that belonged to no one else. Down on the street below the restaurant had begun preparing for the lunch rush, and the sounds of normal life drifted upward through the window. At that same moment, several blocks away, Adrian Russo sat in the back seat of his car, watching the city move past the window once again. He did not call the restaurant. He did not ask anyone whether Grace Walker had arrived. He simply looked out at the streets of Chicago and allowed a small, thoughtful smile to appear. Because sometimes the most powerful decisions did not need to be monitored. Sometimes a small flame in a dark alley was enough to remind the world what dignity looked like.